All right, I think we've eventually got to where we need to be to get going on this evening's topic. And as you can see, this evening's topic is Post-Enlightenment Liturgies. By the end of it, you might know something about what that means, probably a lot more than I know what it means just at the moment. We'll see if we can do some learning together. So, in our last study, we looked at the period up to about 1700, that is the Reformation. And we discovered that in our chatting about it and looking at it, that all denominations inherited from what they'd been given by their medieval predecessors. And sometimes actually the Protestant Reform denominations, like the Lutherans and the Anglicans, kept more of the feel of the medieval church than some of their equivalents in the Roman Catholic Church in the Baroque period and later. So perhaps we discovered then that the Reformation wasn't really such a rupture in Christian ideas of liturgy and worship as we've sometimes been led to believe. Perhaps it was a rupture in terms of its theology, the sacraments and things, but certainly in the way that that expressed itself in the worship of some denominations, it wasn't such a great break. Now today we're going to look at how churches responded to the developments in the period of the Enlightenment. That's after about 1700. In the 18th and the 1900s, Protestant worship went up through major changes. We're going to discover what those changes were in a minute. Roman Catholic churches made even more drastic changes in the 20th century. After Vatican II, and we'll see a little bit what happened to the Roman Catholic Church as well. In contrast to earlier centuries too, with the exception of the very, very earliest churches, Western churches started to borrow things from the Eastern Orthodox churches. And the Eastern Orthodox churches began to borrow things from the Western churches, like the use of the vernacular language, for instance, rather than Greek or Coptic. It's still a little bit controversial in the Eastern churches about whether or not you're allowed to hold an Eastern Orthodox service, say in English or in a different sort of language. There are parts of the Eastern Orthodox Church that accept that, and parts of the Orthodox Church that don't really accept that. So, even though there's this sort of widening variety of possibilities that are existing in the liturgies, there's also this growing consensus of what's going to be essential when it comes to the liturgy. What is liturgy? What does it boil down to? Now, if you're a liturgical scholar, here's a little introduction to the Enlightenment. Some of the key figures of the Enlightenment here, Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau, just to remind us of who these people were, what they thought about human nature, what they thought about human rights, what they thought about the social contract and the role of the state, what they thought about religion, and what they thought was the best type of government. So you can see, take religion, for instance. We can see that Thomas Hobbes, who was very early Enlightenment, he said the nation can only have one unified religion. But Locke said, no, a state can have more than one religion and we must tolerate these different religions. But Rousseau in France said, I'm against organized religion, but I'm not really against God. And we'll see what that means in a minute or two. Here are a few more key Enlightenment figures. Some of them are repeated, but here you've got Voltaire as well, his famous Candide, and Diderot, Montesquieu, and Adam Smith, the Scottish writer of The Wealth of Nations, who was a founder of modern economics. So you can see that this Enlightenment had a dramatic effect on all aspects of human thinking and all aspects of human activity. If you are a liturgical scholar, you'll probably think, I don't really want to study the church's worship in the Enlightenment period, in the 1700s. And I suppose this is for a variety of reasons. People think nothing much happened to the liturgy in the 1700s after the fury of the Reformation. And this is the sort of picture that you have in your mind if you're thinking about liturgy in the 1700s. It's Charles Hayter in Jane Austen's novel Persuasion. On the left, you've got proof that this is not quite the case. People like Newton and other people were active in the 1700s, campaigning against slavery eventually and writing extraordinary hymns along these sorts of lines. But mostly the idea of is a nice country parson with a nice sweet church, just holding little services here and there and not really getting involved in too many dramatic disputes. Nice, like this sort of thing. Here he is, the curate, there's his church in the background. Very, very, very 1800s. So people think, really, nothing much happened in the 1700s to liturgy, and what did happen wasn't very interesting. But also, and I think this is probably more the case, at least in England, it's because the centre of liturgical innovation and reform moved away from Europe to America. And it was in North America that all of these liturgical innovations were tried out that were later initiated by missionaries throughout South America, Africa, and Asia. We'll see what those things were in a little minute, but it was in America where these revivalist things happened, where Protestant liturgies were really forged and looked at in fascinating new ways. Two other little things to notice about the period before we look at the cultural background. When we looked at the liturgy of the Reformation, we discovered something interesting. Although these reformers were saying, get back to the Bible, we want to know what the original version of the Bible was, Greek and Hebrew, they really were not very interested in going back to research the earliest ways in which Christians worshipped. They left that well and truly alone. It's an interesting contrast, isn't it? You would think that the reformers, with their passion about getting back to the earliest, purest church, ad fontes, back to the spring, would say, oh, what did these early Christians do for worship? But they never asked that question, really, or never in a way that could be answered in the same analytic way that they produced versions, new translations of the Bible from the Greek and the Hebrew. Also, in this particular period, something interesting happened. There was a rise of ecumenism. That is, people were interested in looking at what other Christians did. And so it was the origin of liturgical scholarship. People began to ask questions about the liturgy. What did people do? What's the best way of bringing people together? How does this affect what we do now? So the rise of ecumenism led to these sort of liturgical discoveries. It led to revivals of practices that had been abandoned years and years before, and it led to this sharing across all sorts of different denominations. So liturgical history, liturgical theology, ritual studies, all of these disciplines became available to people, and they had an impact on the way people thought about how they worshipped and what they did in churches. So let's have a little think about what the world was like in 1700. The first thing to notice about the period is the Enlightenment, in German the Aufklärung, or le siècle des Lumières, or in English we sometimes call it the Age of Reason. The human mind underwent something of a sort of paradigm shift in this century, and we're still living with the consequences of how we think differently to the way in which people thought before the 1700s. It's still going on, this. It has very deep roots and quite dramatic consequences. Now, despite the 19th century Romantic movement's reaction to the excesses of Enlightenment rationalism, the whole of our modern period, at least up to now, is based on the supremacy of human reason against any external authority. So nobody can impose anything on you. You work it out for yourself. See how it's at the origin of the French and American revolutions? No authority, either from the church or from anywhere else, can force you to think or believe in a certain way. The mind is the center of the universe. It's a closed system, and your rationality is going to be able to figure it all out. And in the age of reason, all these forms of authority were challenged. The judgment of the individual questioned absolutely everything that previous ages had accepted. In politics, it went for politics, it went for religion, it went for science, everything. Nobody had ever thought of defending Christianity on the grounds that, well, it's reasonable, it makes sense to the mind. Nobody had thought that that was even important. They'd said, well, listen, miracles alone guarantee its credibility. Jesus did these miracles. God created the world. I'm being very simplistic here. Why do we have to defend it on the basis of human reason? Human reason itself was created by God and bears witness to the fact that these miracles are true. But the Enlightenment changed completely the grounds on which religion could be defended. Here are a couple of books that take that very seriously by Jonathan Israel and Louis Dupré. Is he known? Not particularly. Anything you want to add about that, Joyce, just now?
No. It's good. Thank you.
Here we go. You can see how it's affecting everywhere. Here, the ignorant natives are being visited, converted, even brought under the sway of reason. Les mortels sont égaux. Ce n'est pas la naissance, c'est la seule vertu qui fait la différence. So this equality of everybody's brain, though they might look different, it was supposed to leak out into the white man's burden to make sure that the reason and dignity of all people should be respected and honoured. Didn't quite work out that way, as we know, but that was the principle that lay behind it. Look at this map of the United States, just as an illustration of the way in which our minds were changed. Look in the east there. The borders in the east follow more or less geographical landscape markings. They look very straight and peculiar to a European's eye, but basically what you've got here is different states of the east formed along geographic lines. Hudson River here, the Connecticut River, is it, that comes down here, forming the border between Vermont and New Hampshire. You've got little sections cut out here in New York and down here in Delaware and what have you. West Virginia certainly looks very sort of integrated into the landscape. But the western two-thirds, look at that. They're laid out in this mathematical grid of 1 mile intervals, apart from here where we can see the effect of the Mississippi River on the borders of Illinois and Tennessee and Mississippi. But even our perception of space changed because of the Enlightenment. That sort of business would have been unthinkable before. People would have laid things out on the basis of where the monuments were, where the sacred places were, where the rivers ran or the mountains ran. But of course, the people who came over from Europe had no interest in the native people's understanding of geography in that way. They were affected by the Enlightenment and cut up the map in conformity with their Enlightenment principles. And we're living with the consequences of that even today in more than just maps, but in the way in which the landscape has been understood even. Now, of course, worship couldn't escape this shift in human consciousness either. This man, Immanuel Kant, sapere aude, learn to hear, I suppose.
No,
more or less.
Dare.
Aude.
Dare to know.
Dare to know, dare to know, dare to know. Well, your Latin is much more up to date than mine. Dare to know. Aude, to dare. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Audace.
Audace, yes. Dare to know. So that's a great principle of the Enlightenment. We've just started talking about Kant and a horrible big black fly has appeared. He's one of the great Enlightenment philosophers, and he says, basically, there are three kinds of illusory faith. Faith in miracles, faith in mysteries, and faith in the means of grace. Now, what does he mean by the means of grace? Well, he means the sacraments, basically. The sacraments have no effective operation that can be understood or comprehended or absorbed by anything other than reason. So, the sacraments as a means of grace is a religious illusion that can do naught but work counter to the spirit of religion. You might find that quotation a little strange because he sounds like he's defending religion. Well, in one way, the Enlightenment philosophers did defend religion, but what sort of religion was it that they were defending? It was a religion that was stripped of anything that you could call miraculous, anything that you could call mysterious, and anything that you could call sacramental, understood in the way that the Church had understood sacraments for a very, very long time before. So, he said, baptism and communion have merit so long as you don't see them as a means of grace or a means of salvation in any way whatsoever. The traditional view that God uses sacraments as a means of grace is just dismissed by Kant completely. The only thing left for religion is to pursue virtue, to be a virtuous person. And the liturgy, therefore, is going to be judged not by how mysterious it was, how miraculous it was, how well people received and understood the sacraments as a means of grace, as a means of God's participation in what was happening. All of that was discounted. They would say the only way you can judge a good liturgy is to see if it's made people better people, virtuously, morally. Now, this was a huge challenge to this is William Paley. It's a famous illustration of what Enlightenment the views of God were. Basically, William Paley said it's like God is like a watchmaker. We know that God exists because, take for example, you found a watch on a walk. You would say, oh golly, this can't have happened by accident. It must have been put together by something. And by analogy, you can say the same thing about nature. It works together so well, it's so logical, and some things eat other things and are eaten by other things, and all the bits work together. Nature displays this sort of purpose. It has a regularity, it has an order to it. But here's the catch. What happened? God made the universe in order, he wound it up and wandered off, left it on the hill to click out its time according to its own internal laws. God is not going to come back and tinker with it. He's not going to come back and make it go faster or slower. He's not going to come back and make us think differently about time. The universe has been set in motion like a machine, and God is now, essentially, apart from being the creator of it, absent from it. This rather stupid argument has been revived in two interesting places. One by creation theorists, Christians, who've come back to this as a way of disproving evolution, and by another chappie too. They make very interesting bedfellows. This is Richard Dawkins, who's come back to this argument from the clock to disprove the existence of God. Well, Christians never used it to prove the existence of God in the first place. It was an Enlightenment ruse to enable certain people to be able to continue to believe in a God who'd got nothing to do with the world apart from having created it. So Richard Dawkins here has set up this sort of straw man, the so-called Christian who believes in argument from design, and quite rightly demolished it. But it's not an argument against Christianity, it's an argument against the clockmaker theory of the creation of the world that prevailed in the Enlightenment period.
What's important to remember too is that that this idea of like God creating the world and then not doing anything about it is a very old idea. So it's present in Greek philosophy and like Stoicism. So it's a very old idea, but something happened in the modern period to make it largely believable and to actually make it kind of a form of a norm. So there is a shift. Like it's not a new idea itself, but there is a change in the organization of society, of powers, of how we conceive human being that make it possible to actually become the major conception of God. But like Christians are known about this argument for a long time. It's present in Stoicism, for instance. But they never found it convincing because they had other teachings, and they found that it was less convincing than that. So something happened for that to happen.
For that to have happened.
Yeah.
And of course, this great challenge to the way the sovereignty of the human mind is a huge challenge to both Catholics and to Protestants as well. Because both Catholics and Protestants believe that God acted, especially in worship, by giving of himself. So this Enlightenment God has retired after he's created the universe. And he's left it to work according to design. And it's not a God who can be active in any reciprocal way in the liturgy or in worship. Here you've got a slide in front of you which is very different from that idea. Here is a God intervening in worship, present in worship in a sacramental means of grace sort of way. In the late medieval, early Reformation period, these images were very popular, of a Christ actually on the altar with a riven side filling the communion cup. This is a relationship sort of sacramental liturgy, not a sort of dry deist liturgical understanding of moral correctness to work well as a cog in the great watch that God has created as the universe.
Yeah. So we can ask, like, what's the problem? What's the question? Why this happened? Well, as you mentioned it, like it's because the humanistic and Enlightenment conception of man is a very reductionist understanding of man. It's basically saying the human reason is the supreme faculty of human beings, and all the human's faculties, imagination, senses, have to be subdued to this faculty. And that's not how medieval, like pre-modern people thought, because they thought, well, we have different faculties, like in like medieval theology, reason plays a big role, but it's never risen to be this idol and this restrictive faculty that modernity has created, and that's a big difference, and that's also asking questions like, what is human being, and do you think it's this reductive, control freak reason, or is it the wholeness of your body and your senses and your imagination, and these faculties like imagination, senses are faculties that are being controlled by the modern thinking. So that's a different conception of human beings that lead to different conceptions and relationships to God too.
That certainly happened in this period, and we're still living with the consequences. So it was a huge onslaught to the world of belief that implicated all the things that Joris has just mentioned. Belief is just not a question of intellectual reductionism. It's a question of the whole human being participating in a relationship with God in all of the complexity and beauty that implies. So how did religion respond? How did they cope with this onslaught? Well, they had several ways of doing it, I suppose, some more or less successful than others. First of all, it could just ignore it and say, oh, well, that's interesting, you get on with it, and we'll get on with what we do. They could just ignore what the Enlightenment was saying about the human mind. So here you've got a picture from the Enlightenment period of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin that is full of, well, just looking elsewhere, basically. There's nothing Enlightenment particularly about this. It's trying to keep on with business as usual and pretend that Kant never existed. So it leads to a certain sort of schizoid mentality, if you want. You're living in the world, but you're certainly not in the world at all, even. You'd probably still be able to use a cell phone and stuff, and modern medicine. It's just this other bit of it that you don't want. And that's a very uncomfortable relationship to have with the culture around you, and maybe for some it worked pretty well. There's also a slightly more reactionary way of dealing with the sovereignty of the mind in religion. Secondly, you can say, look, the mind isn't everything. In fact, what we need is the heart. We're going to appeal to something that is beyond reason. Personal experience of God's acts could be conveyed in the sacraments. Personal experience trumps reason. The Methodists in particular took this line, but you can also see that it's happening here in the Roman Catholic Church too. These great figures who've had personal encounters with God in one way or another that were prioritized over reason. To say religion is actually more about emotion than it is about the brain. Here is a picture of revival services in New York State, I believe. Oh no, it's in the sunny South, it says. Yeah, well, a seeker at the meeting. This is another aspect of this time. This goes beyond reason. This isn't reason that has converted these people to godly ways. It is the powerful emotions that come over people when they encounter God. There's a third possibility, and it's generally now the American Protestant position, and that is to have recourse only to the Bible. God's acts are recorded in the Bible, and all you're able to do now is to commemorate them. So when you're a worshipper at communion or baptism, what you're doing is performing something. You're not participating in anything, really. The performance aspect of it conjures up the memory of God's deeds in the past. So you're not the recipient of anything, you're more the performer of baptism or the performer of the Eucharist. Not just as the presider of it either. You're performing it when you're with the people, you're performing a common act of remembrance. That's basically it. And the only reason that the sacraments continue, here you have a Reformed communion service, where there doesn't seem to be much mystery present, to say the least. Is it a means of grace, or is it a means of just remembering what the Bible says? So the Bible says, "Do this in memory of me," says Jesus. So here you go. They're doing it in memory of Jesus. The Bible also says, there's another picture I think we've seen before. Here's an act of remembrance, not a sacramental present, being the recipient of a means of grace, an interactive means of grace. This is something else that is happening here. The Bible also says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them." So Jesus told us to do it, and we're doing them in memory of Jesus. The acts themselves don't carry any incipient, miraculous, grace-filled quality. They're not magic.
It's interesting how it becomes liturgy, and we talked already about that, but liturgy becomes more and more of a performance, so like more akin to a theater play, and the identity of the person performing becomes more than the identity of actors, because you like an actor when he's playing a part, a role, they're not giving the whole of their identity, they're not endangering the whole of their being by acting, although there's a very complex process at stake. But that's it's a way of wearing a mask too. And
Yes, that's
elements also become props, and
Yes. Yeah.
and so it's less integrated, let's say.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. You're dealing with props and not the presence of Christ as a means of grace in the bread and wine, recognizing the sacredness of the things that you're handling that stand for a larger relationship with God in other parts of your life.
Yeah. It's less dangerous.
It's less dangerous. Yeah. So it would be impossible to understand the approach to the sacraments of most American Protestants, and probably quite a few American Catholics as well, unless you've got some sort of understanding of these Enlightenment concepts of God, who was once active in history, but now his sacramental presence can only be conjured up in memory, rather than through a living present. Also, the Romantic movement was a reaction to this supremacy of reason, a reaction to the Enlightenment. What it did was glorify the past. It loved the picturesque in the past as well. It was a sort of nostalgic movement, perhaps, more than anything else. It sought these exalted feelings, the sort of dream of the past.
Maybe if we can show again the picture before, the one of Virgin Mary, to show that,
Yes.
like the three pictures and what you're going to talk about, Nigel, all of them show the continuation of the disengagement of religion from the world. So in this picture, like it's looking up, but it's also becoming more and more disengaged with the physical reality, because it's making it very ideal. You see like all this beautiful Virgin Mary, everything is perfect and everything. On this one, it's also what is happening in a sense. Because of this performance, it's also making things ideal. So in both cases, in very different way, there's nothing broken. Like it's things are neat and tidy in different ways and with more or less decorum. But there's less risk, there's less messiness about it.
Yes, certainly in contrast to this sort of
Yes.
picture.
Yeah.
It seems to be more engaged in all sorts of ways with everybody here than
And you
these
can see on
others
this picture,
for
you
a
can
sort
see
of-
imagination,
Yes.
the different levels of reality, because you have like a kind of living Christ on the altar, so it's kind of a vision. So you see like the line between what is material and what is spiritual is blurred on this picture, whereas on the other pictures, this one, like it's purely spiritual, and on the other one, it's purely materialistic.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's a form of a split, and people fall more and more on one or the other side.
Yes. Yeah. So this Romantic movement then, it loved the picturesque. It sought these exalted feelings, but most of your feelings were going to be focused on what the individual felt, not what a community of worshippers felt. What do you feel? How have you appropriated it? It's another sort of side effect of the Enlightenment's focus on the limited nature of the trap of the human individual's mind. It's the human individual's feelings as well. So Romanticism had this huge impact on the liturgy. It led to a sort of medievalism, the Gothic revival, for instance. This is a picture of my church in Stone, back where I went to Sunday school when I was a little kid. If you look on the left there, you say, is that a classical building or is it a Gothic building? It just seems to embody this struggle of the Enlightenment that the church had with the Enlightenment. They're trying to be ordered and neat, and they've got this sort of little pediment up here that looks vaguely classical. It's arranged in a vaguely classical way. The tower is very square. It looks a little bit as if Christopher Wren had a Gothic nightmare. But on the right, only when you go inside the church do you realise that, oh yes, it's Gothic, but it's sort of schizophrenic. And it's schizophrenic because of this tension. It's one of the earliest Gothic revival churches in the Oxford movement in England, because the previous one blew down in a storm in the late 1700s. So this is very, very early Gothic revival. And I put it there just to give you an illustration of that. So this medievalism, this romanticization of the past, this picturesque idea of the imagination looking back to a more sunny time, it also reflected itself in revivalism too. Here's George Whitefield. You can always tell it's him because he has a squint and his arms are always up in the air. So this is this personal relationship with Jesus expressed in emotion that was also a reaction against the supremacy of human reason. Now, the Methodist tradition also, here's John Wesley, a famous statue in Savannah, Georgia, I believe. This is a sort of countercultural movement to the Enlightenment. Now, what the Enlightenment had done, as we can see, had been to sideline sacramental worship because they weren't happy with the sacraments, really. So some of the reformers were drifting away from the sacraments because they weren't seen to be sort of out of kilter with the prevailing feeling of the time. But Methodism's founder, John Wesley, he was born in 1703 and he died in 1791, he insisted on frequent communion. He said you should take communion once a week, if possible. The Methodist movement stressed something that Wesley himself called the warming of the heart. And in the society at the time that looked askance at any sort of zeal, any sort of personal enthusiasm, any outpouring of emotion, the Methodists were really quite distrusted in some ways because they put all of these in, front and centre. The Methodists were accused of being too enthusiastic. Here's another John Wesley preaching on his father's grave. And you can see emotions are being expressed in this group of people, especially down here on the right, which is presumably Wesley's mother, perhaps. May have reasons to be upset. There's another famous figure here I wanted to look at briefly. If I can get my notes to come back. This is a chap called Billy Bray. He was a famous Methodist preacher, quite a lot later than John Wesley. He was a Cornish miner down in the south west of England, and he was born and died in the same parish of Cea, near Truro, the capital city of Cornwall, aged 73 years old. He famously said, "Nothing is going to stop me preaching and rejoicing in God. And if they tried to imprison me and stop me," because they tried to stop him with these revivalist missions and all of the rest of it. He said, "If they were to put me in a barrel, I would shout glory through the bunghole, praise the Lord. Nothing would stop him, even if he was bound up in a barrel. He'd find a way of praising God from inside it." He's a colourful and wonderful character, like so many of those great Methodist preachers who bound together, especially in the earliest period, a sacramental theology that was quite profound, and this enthusiasm, this warming of the heart. But perhaps you won't be surprised to hear, much of this sacramental side of Methodism sank somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic when Methodism came over to the United States. It accommodated itself very easily to the Enlightenment spirit of the newly independent United States and lost quite a lot of its sacramental content that John Wesley in particular had really championed. Now, the missionaries to the American frontier were active beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And the camp meeting at this time became the centre of their worship and their liturgy. Perhaps its modern inheritor is televangelism of this particular manifestation of Christian liturgy. We'll come back to them in a little minute. But here, as you can see, they're quite dramatic events. They are conjuring up, these revival meetings are conjuring up this movement of engagement of emotion as a reaction to the Enlightenment, saying, the way forward for Christian worship is to conjure up these emotions and get them going and take religion out of the sphere of the human mind and put it into an affective place. The Pentecostal tradition had no inhibitions at all about experiencing the reality of God's presence in worship, and those spirit-filled gifts came into all of their services. They were inclined to see the sacraments as rather tame, in fact. When you can experience God's present activity in such an overwhelming emotional way, why fiddle around with bread and wine? You see, the Pentecostal reaction to the Enlightenment is also a reaction to what the Church had done. The Church had stripped the sacraments of all of their affective, emotional, integrated, embodied aspects and turned them into acts of abstract remembrance or acts of technical sophistication. So Pentecostalism isn't just an outpouring of the Spirit. Pentecostalism is an indictment of the Church's stripping of the sacraments of this sort of content. And it's one way of understanding what Pentecostalism is about, and not being so sort of judgmental or sort of averse to it. This is partly what the Church has done, the institutional Church.
I think another interesting, because what's the difference then between this type of practice and, let's say, like prophecy, like in the early Church? What's the difference?
I would say there isn't much, apart from the fact that, well, I'm sure in many Pentecostal churches this does happen, that the body of the church, as their response to somebody speaking in tongues or prophesying, will come together to interpret it and say, does this message integrate itself with our experience as a body of Christ? It's not just free-flow individuals having a bit of a go, that they're living together there in communities.
What I can see is like also a lot of these churches are based on the Bible-based, and so a lot of their experience also triggered by very intellectual concepts. So like you have sin that defines a certain realities, and things are really neat and tidy, and there is a form of it's kind of like it's gone through the Enlightenment, these movements, because it's a reaction to it, and so much of what they react to and what they use in the worship is also very rational, as strange as it can appear. But most of these movements are based on like very strict theologies, which are very codified in a very rational way and don't give so much room for interpretation or for imagination at that level.
I see.
So it's more like kind of the enforcement or like the experience of these concepts, like so sin and salvation, like this big binary that creates the emotion that actually like an physical experience. You see, like there is a lot of thinking into what can seem very sensitive, like very physical.
I think that's right, but one of the fascinating things about this is that it's manifest itself in several different denominations, and with the same sort of intensity very often. It's not that, this group has the monopoly of it. This is a traditional Pentecostalist church.
But what's interesting is that this movement happens also in context of like Bible, like communities that are very found of the Bible.
That's a Roman Catholic church
Oh, but that's way because that's late.
That's yes.
Late, way after
Yes.
our period.
After the charismatic revival in the Roman Catholic Church.
That's
but
way
but
later.
that,
In the
I
20th
mean,
century,
it will be
yes.
interesting to ask some of these people in a Roman Catholic Church if the Bible has played a role in their experience here. It might do for these nuns, perhaps. And now perhaps the modern charismatic revival is less a reaction to the Enlightenment and more a move into a new appropriation of these other embodied things that the Church has forgotten or laid to one side.
Yeah. They always go through this very reduced vocabulary created by modernity.
Yes.
And modern religiosity.
Though I would have to say that my experience of the charismatic church, in the Church of England at least, in St John's Church, Harborne, which was, yes, very Bible-centred, probably had an understanding of grace, forgiveness and sin. Yes, I would say that that was certainly true, but it was also a very embodied experience. People actually took care of each other, they listened to each other, they helped each other out in their marital difficulties or their bereavements or whatever else was happening to them. And that to sort of say that this was somehow a reaction against reason, although importing some of reason's categories, wouldn't be doing justice to the full three-dimensional religious experience of the thing. That sociologically, yes, that might be what's behind it, but also it's a reclaiming of the fact that God can intervene in this way, even given the strictures and limitations of our cultural background, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes more sense.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't stay in it. It wasn't my taste. It doesn't freak me out quite so much as it did when I first came across it, I think. Yeah. Perhaps that's something we can raise. Linnea, yes, yeah.
Nigel, I wanted to add a comment too. Is now a good time, or should I wait until the end?
No, that's fine. Yeah.
No, I was just wanting to also chime in about what you and Joyce have just discussed, having also had been involved with charismatic churches, Methodist charismatic church, and I guess movement is probably a good word, in South Africa, and then also having occasionally attended church with my Pentecostal grandmother as a child. And so those were two different denominations, but and two different continents. One was in the US and one was in South Africa. And it was extraordinary how similar the actual experiences were, even though the teaching was different and the approach was different. And I think especially in the case of South Africa, it was a Methodist church, which normally you don't necessarily find this. It looks very close to Anglican style worship. But I think there was definitely a cultural influence of being in South Africa with Zulu-speaking Methodists, and with a cultural tradition that gives itself to more singing and dancing that I think also definitely played a role. So it was an overwhelmingly positive experience for me, but I've learned not to speak about it in the Episcopal Church. So I just want to add the cultural element. And my experience was that, no one that I met would have had any kind of reflection on this being a modern reaction. They probably were not aware at all of that theological aspect of it. They were just going to church, I think.
Yes, yeah.
Thanks.
Living in the climate of the time. Thank you, Linnea. Yeah. Let's move on for a second. And in the Roman Catholic Church up to about 1963, Vatican II, the official liturgical text that we talked about last week, they were universally and rather rigidly applied across the board, all the way through the period, from when they were first promulgated at the end of the 1500s, right up to 1963. So much so that if you were a Native American convert in California, you would hear and you would see the same liturgy, the same forms of worship as the French king would see in Versailles. Would be the same service, more or less, with some limitations maybe in one way or another, according to space and richness. But in the meantime, the liturgy didn't change, the worship form didn't change, but the piety did, as we saw last week. Their architecture did, the music continued to evolve within the Roman Catholic Church, but the liturgy, the worship, stayed pretty much fossilized and universally, strictly applied. But a big change started to come about in about 1833 with the revival of monasticism in France, in Germany, and in Belgium. They'd been almost wiped out by forces brought on in the Enlightenment. As we know, in France, many of those places were suppressed during the Revolution, including great abbeys like Bec-et-Loing. The revival of monasticism in the 1830s brought about a sort of liturgical movement that tried to restore these past glories of worship, like Gregorian chant. So you can see in this picture, this is a book published around about that time, which gives you the Sunday, the first Sunday of Advent, Gregorian chant for that particular day. Following World War II in the Roman Catholic Church, a second liturgical movement arose in the Roman Catholic Church in countries especially that were in very close contact with Protestant worship, like America or England or Australia. And it took places in Roman Catholic parishes in the 1950s and in the early 1960s. Their emphasis suddenly turned to preaching and using the language of the people in their worship, and having the congregation join in song. If we know anything about Vatican II a little bit, we sometimes think, oh, that was when the church changed its mind on language, not using Latin anymore. But actually the movement sprang up from the people first. It wasn't as if Vatican II happened in a vacuum. It happened as a result partly of this revival of monasticism and partly because Roman Catholics were speaking and engaged in the ecumenical movement with their Protestant brothers and sisters who were worshipping in the vernacular, who had songs that they could sing within the context of the Mass. So you can see that around this time, this movement began in the Roman Catholic Church that has resulted nowadays in quite a lot of the worship that we do looking a bit the same. In fact, in some churches, you have to look at the bulletin to see if you're in a Roman Catholic church, a Methodist church, a Lutheran church, or an Episcopal church. You might not have much idea. And this is partly as a result of this movement that sprang up following World War II. Also, Protestant churches started to borrow quite a lot of Vatican II reforms, like the 3-year lectionary, for instance. This sprang up at this particular period. Contemporary English instead of Elizabethan English. They tried to keep the two going right the way through the 60s, 70s, 80s, so that you had this liturgical Rite 1 and liturgical Rite 2. It still exists to a certain extent, but it was the same liturgical movement that brought about new translations of the Lord's Prayer, say, new translations of the canon of the Mass. A huge variety of different liturgical forms. So I would say, however, that evangelicals, on the other hand, haven't really been affected quite so much in their worship life by these changes. There may be a movement now amongst certain more evangelical denominations to adopt a sort of more liturgical forms of worship, more ritual-based forms of worship, if you want. But certainly in the period that we're talking about up through the 60s and 70s and 80s, even to some extent now, that is most certainly not the case. Let's talk briefly about baptism. Who are the proper candidates for baptism? who should you baptize? Now, denominations who advocate for infant baptism have been opposed to those who insist that baptism can only be done to a believer. And a believer has to be of a certain age and think and say certain things. Interestingly enough, some of the people who were involved in this debate have changed sides. So Karl Barth, who was a leading Reformed theologian in the 20th century, actually strongly criticised infant baptism. He didn't like it so much for reasons that were very Protestant. But in earlier periods, Luther would have disagreed with him very strongly. More recently, some Catholic, Roman Catholic theologians have questioned the baptism of infants. But people who advocate for believers, but the Roman Catholic Church came out strongly against the theologians who suggested that, so it's still the official position of the Roman Catholic Church that infants should be baptized, but theologians have been challenging it in both denominations. People who advocate for believers' baptism, only baptizing people who are old enough to get baptized, are perhaps the largest group of Christians in America. If you combine this frontier evangelical worship and Pentecostal traditions. And here's why. In the Enlightenment, it was impossible to believe that God could act outside a conscious and active, rational recipient. If your brain wasn't up to it, God could do nothing. You had to think properly before you could get baptized. So partly as a result of the Enlightenment, these movements arose within the Protestant Church of baptizing only adults. Once again, we can see this emphasis on adult baptism was a reaction against the Enlightenment, or a sort of response to the Enlightenment, a taking on the Enlightenment's criterion that actually you had to be rational to have an engagement with God. Even though they rebelled against that in some other places, in this place they said, yes, we agree. Baptism would only work if the person was old enough to understand what was happening. In European countries, where baptism of children was standard practice, it often came about that children were baptized regardless of the belief of their parents. So in the parish that I was in Birmingham, for instance, the people would come and they'd say, we want to get our baby done. And so you would sort of go through a series of questions, and it's clear that they really didn't have very much idea of what Jesus did on the cross and why, for instance, let alone anything else. They might have had some vague understanding of the Christmas story if they'd had another baby, and went to the church school, but that was about it. So in those sort of families, a little bit of water in private is all it takes, and it doesn't really matter what the parents believe. So here we have the baptism of whatever the baby was called. Who is it? That's Harry and Meghan. Is it George? I don't know, they all have those names, don't they? Anyway, I'm not saying much about the family that's gathered around here. They may be great believers. I don't know. But the practice of baptizing babies in private, in an antique font, in some room in Buckingham Palace or wherever it takes place, it's not really done much to champion infant baptism from criticism of those who say you have to be of a certain age to be baptized. I'm sorry I put that picture up there, but there we go. But it does illustrate it quite powerfully, doesn't it, between these two things. Which do you think is more religious? Well, no comment. So how was the rite done? What happened? Well, Methodists used to insist on the rubrics of the Common Prayer. As we discovered a couple of weeks ago, that meant the whole baby had to be dipped in the water. But later in life, Wesley he allowed pouring and sprinkling. Most of those groups that originated on the American frontier, and many Pentecostals, they insist on the immersion of adults as being the only biblical option. So this sort of baptism, total immersion baptism. And incidentally, in the presence of the assembled church, not in a gilded room of Buckingham Palace. Interestingly enough, rather ironically, I would say that those groups that we consider anti-sacrament, like the Baptists or the Pentecostalists or certain evangelicals, they show more reverence and sacramental instinct about baptism than many of the so-called sacramental churches that baptized infants in private with a little bit of water, not enough to spoil the robe. Thank you very much. Now, lots of these churches here, they would avoid the word sacrament, and instead they would say an ordinance. They're performing the ordinance of baptism because they're carrying out Jesus' ordinance, his order, his command to baptize. But just because they call it an ordinance and not a sacrament doesn't mean that this, to me, or to anybody else probably, looks far more sacramental than this disembodied affair here, if that makes sense. Wesley introduced the importance of conversion, definitely, and he eliminated confirmation. You know how we talked about the baptism of a child being followed later on by confirmation, so that the rite got splintered into little bits. And this emphasis on the conversion experience, this new birth, being born again, that began to have a major influence on evangelicals of every tradition, springing from Wesley. And for many people, it was a prerequisite for believers' baptism. The person must be, in fact, born again before you can baptize them. But this leads to a problem. Can you see what it is? This process of being born again is the real initiatory event, the real emotion-filled moment where you, for the first time, give your life to Jesus, is the place where you're initiated into the Christian community. Mm-hmm. And so baptism now simply becomes a little sign that says, yes, that's what's happened. It's not a means of grace anymore. It's a sign that the grace has already happened.
It's the graduation.
It's the graduation ceremony. Yes, you've already passed. So what was baptism for in this case? Did it just signify something that's already happened? Or did it actually do something? Did it bring about the conversion? Did it effect it? So here you've got a major problem now between people who say that God acts in baptism and people who say that baptism is just a human sign of your profession. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, baptism, interestingly, is the one sacrament that nobody questions the validity of the practice of other Christians. If you've been baptized by anybody, your baptism is accepted in other denominations.
As long as you're baptized in the name.
As long as you are baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, in the biblical formula. If you're baptized in the name of the Creator, the Sustainer, and the Inspirer, on the baptism certificate, most denominations would say, aye, this looks like a strange thing. We are going to have to redo it with the different formula. It's also the sacrament, I think, in which equality amongst all people is most apparent. In other words, it's the sacrament we all go through as Christians. It's perhaps the most important initiatory sacrament, even if you have been ordained a deacon or ordained a priest or consecrated a bishop. your baptism is still the most important initiatory rite that ever happened to you, or could happen to you. So it's become a sort of source of crusade for justice within churches as well. Do you believe in the dignity of every human being? That's when we say we renew our baptismal vows. There's a strong link between baptism and the equality of all people that's inherent in the rite itself. So, if you're initiated into the royal priesthood of Christ when you're baptized, why can't you be a candidate for ordination if you're a woman? Why is there something different about you? You had the same initiatory rite. You are welcome into the royal priesthood of Christ, says the baptism rite, but the next stage is not for you. There's also been, I mentioned earlier on, that if you're baptized in the name of the Creator, the Sustainer, and the something or other, Inspirer, Redeemer, this is partly in reaction to the fact that the baptism formula is sometimes being considered to be too masculine. So in the name of the Father and of the Son, rather than in the name of the Mother and the Daughter. So it's one way of trying to address that, slightly clumsily perhaps, but you can see where it's coming from.
It's also Trinitarian.
And it's also Trinitarian, yeah. Now, we saw in these early centuries, didn't we, that there were all sorts of rich biblical metaphors for baptism. One of those early Christians said, it's a bit like when you add water to flour to enable the yeast to begin to work and do its job, and the Spirit to infuse the loaf. So it's not as if people all through the ages have got one idea of what baptism is. We think nowadays, all sorts of people think different things about baptism and it's not good, adults and children, and people are using different images for it, and surely this is not a very good thing. But actually, this is a tradition of the early church. The diversity of this modern practice of baptism harks back to a really rich tradition of how people viewed baptism. It's not just one image. It expresses all sorts of different ways of what it means to begin a new life in Christ. All sorts of people have different experiences of that and come to it in different ways. So it's not a bad thing that there are many ways of understanding baptism. The time is getting on, so we're going to nip through another couple of things. Daily public prayer. See, this is what Saint-Esprit is going to look like in a few years' time, probably. Given our current trajectory.
Well, you have to find some more youth.
Yes, exactly. All the way through the 1700s and beyond, daily public prayer actually thrived in the Anglican tradition. And also the daily office provided a big portion of the Sunday services in Anglican churches as well, in morning prayer on a Sunday, until it got to be replaced by a sort of weekly Eucharist as a response to the Oxford movement. The Romantic movement also introduced these vested choirs in parish churches to sing morning and evening prayers. Here's an example, I think, in King's College, Cambridge. Not entirely sure of that. Also, interestingly enough, the new technology of gas lighting, the ability to light the sanctuary with gas, led to a new popularity for choral evensong. So we think, this is the first time that technology has had an impact on worship when we're all Zooming and YouTubing and all of the rest of it. No, that's not exactly true. Technology has had an impact on worship for a very long time in all sorts of different ways. And certainly the choral evensong is one of them, even though we've got so romantic candles here. It wouldn't be quite so romantic if these people couldn't read their music because the lights weren't on behind them. A bit like Joyce and I the other evening in evensong. Archie, yes, sorry, thanks Linnea. In the Lutheran churches, morning and evening prayer didn't fare so well. In fact, it had disappeared by 1790 from most German cities. This regular practice of morning and evening prayer that Luther encouraged simply evaporated. For Roman Catholics, daily morning and prayer and evening prayer and the other offices remained this monopoly of the clergy and of religious orders. And even as late as 1971, this is the morning, evening prayer book of the Roman Catholic Church. It also contains all sorts of other offices, the Liturgy of the Hours. It's got Lauds, midday prayer, Vespers, Compline, and an office of readings to use at any time during the day. These things cost about $60 each. They're extremely complicated. They have about 10 tabs and inserts on little bits of card for frequently repeated canticles or antiphons. And this is the reformed version of it. They've had a go at tidying it up to make it easier for people to use. But despite all of these attempts to reform it and tidy it up, it still remains, after all of this time, more of a monastic office. It seems virtually indifferent to the needs of ordinary people. I used to have to do it in Tottenham, morning and evening, and believe me, it was a right menace to have to find the right place in the book on the right day and determine whether the saint of the day dictated what collect and antiphon that you were going to use for the Magnificat. And it was really quite a bother. And the last thing you wanted to do by the time you'd figured out what to say was actually to say it, let alone to pray while you were doing it, because you were constantly afraid that you'd got your finger in the wrong part of the book and Father Hopes was going to creep up behind you and bash you over the head with one of them. The Methodists began a sort of weekly study group and mutual support group meeting in the 1700s, so quite early. And this was the origin in America of the midweek prayer meeting. It was popular religion at its best. It was often presided over by a lay person, and it consisted of spontaneous prayer, which could in fact be quite repetitious, singing of hymns, and the reading of favourite scripture texts. I remember going to the Young Men's Bible Study Hour in Birmingham. Well, by this time, most of the young men had either deceased or become rather elderly, and it was presided over by Mr. and Mrs. Pearson, and it was well within this midweek study prayer group mutual support meeting. And the prayers were actually quite repetitive. They would say things like, "Oh Lord, we pray for Enid, who's laid on one side on a bed of sickness, and we do pray that you will undertake for her. We lift up Mr. Snodgrass." Well, he was a sort of elderly and rather portly gentleman, and the idea of lifting him up anywhere was quite a thought. But the thing that I found interesting about it was this sort of formulaic prayer was something that the Anglicans do too, and the Roman Catholics do as well. Just because they're formulas that are not quite familiar to us doesn't mean that God can't listen to them, and formulas are something that we're at home with sometimes, especially when it comes to dealing with a potential emotion around somebody that we're praying for. We like to fall back on those formulas a little bit and lift people up who are laid on one side on a bed of sickness. Anyway, in the 1830s, it became quite common in Western New York to encourage women to pray aloud in this prayer meeting, this Methodist prayer meeting. And that absolutely scandalized some of the more conservative clergy of New England. Charles Finney, whom you may have come across, we'll look at him again in a second. He said this: "Set women to praying? Why, the next thing I suppose will be to set them preaching." As if to say this is a dreadful thing. Thanks again, Linnea. In the Methodist Church in Seneca Falls in 1848, here it is, there was held the first women's rights convention, and it sprung out of this midweek Bible study prayer group held in the Methodist tradition. And this sort of launched an array of these social crusades for universal suffrage, for instance, for the rights of women in all sorts of different ways. It's a fascinating story to see how social engagement is flowing out of some of these liturgical, regularly repeated traditions, and how that continues to be the case in fertile engagement with what we're doing just at the moment too. It's a really fascinating story. The Enlightenment took a very dim view of sacraments in general. Does somebody want to say something? The Enlightenment took a very dim view of the sacraments in general, as we just saw, and of the Eucharist in particular. Anybody got any guesses as to what this man's job might be?
He's British.
He's British, most certainly, and he's a bishop. Yep, it's difficult to tell, but you can just see the tabs under that gold brocade, and he's sitting in front of a fancy window. I suppose if we could see his legs, we could probably tell that he was wearing gaiters. The Roman Catholics generally reacted to the Enlightenment by ignoring it, either passively or aggressively, in the case of the Jansenists, for instance. I think I have a picture of them in a minute. Their main concern when it came to the Eucharist was to make sure that it was valid. Did they do anything? Did they do it all right? Was the bare minimum necessary for the assurance of a work of grace? So gradually the Roman Catholic communion service became to look more and more like a sort of focus on the mechanical efficacy of the Mass. Has everything been done in the right order and in the proper way? In the Protestant church, like here, this particular Anglican bishop, the Eucharist became to be seen to be more of a sort of memorial that we keep because Jesus asked us to do it. So this is the Anglican bishop Hoadley, and he said, well, those words, in memory of me, specifically signified that Christ was not present in the sacrament. We're doing it in memory, just like we might do it in memory of somebody who's moved to Jamaica, or in memory of somebody whose birthday isn't anymore, they're not any long with us. So the very fact that we have to do it in memory of means that Christ is not present in the Eucharist. It was very, very, very controversial at the time. He was much criticised by the descendants of the Anglican divines in the 1600s. And most of the communion services preached by people like this would be boiled down to the words something like, Jesus died, be good. That would be it. Oops. Here's John Wesley. Methodism viewed the Eucharist as a means of grace, most certainly, in which the presence of Christ can be experienced. So there's a collection of hymns on the Lord's Supper written by John Wesley. There are 166 of them. The Wesleys published this book in 1745, and they go beyond this sort of negativism of sacrifice to a place where they describe the presence of Christ in the Eucharist as a mystery. That comes over very often in these hymns. The Eucharist, they say, is the work of the Spirit. The Eucharist is a foretaste of the kingdom. That comes out very, very often in these hymns. But once again, unfortunately, perhaps not much of that sort of Eucharistic piety made it over the Atlantic to the practice of Methodism in the United States. The founders of the Disciples of Christ in Kentucky in 1832 insisted on a weekly celebration of the Lord's Supper This is Alexander Campbell, Scottish man, active in Kentucky in 1832, and founded the Disciples of Christ, as well as some other groups and denominations. And soon after Alexander Campbell, the New Mormon movement also insisted on a weekly Eucharist, as did the Plymouth Brethren, a reformed group back that was founded in England but moved over here. The Oxford movement, or the Catholic revival in England, the Church of England in the mid-1800s, had a huge impact on the liturgy and the worship of the church. No words of the prayer book were changed, not one. But almost every other aspect of Anglican worship was changed. Vestments, candles and a cross on the altar table, a stone altar, incense, the presider with his back to the congregation, water and wine in the chalice, incense, I've mentioned that. All of these things and more were revived. Pilgrimages, all of the rest of it. This is Keble College in Oxford, founded in memory of John Keble, who was one of the leaders of the Oxford movement. This is the college where our Bishop Alan Shin was the chaplain for several years. The joke is it has the largest bathroom in Christendom because it's the interior of the chapel is all in Minton tiles, which were also used for Victorian bathrooms. Have a little look online, you'll be able to see the images of it. I didn't have time to put one up. In the Roman Catholic Church in the 60s, the entire Mass was translated into the various languages of the world. The structure of the Mass was returned to that of the early Church after all of this liturgical research and revival. Preaching was now required every Sunday. The altar tables were moved so that priests could celebrate facing the people. And because of the rise of the social sciences, this question started to be asked: how do human beings perceive reality? How do human beings actually relate to each other? So these social sciences have been used to understand liturgical practices, and the quality of the celebration has become a major concern. Not its efficacy, not how it relates to theology and all of those things. Questions like, do you use real bread? Are we going to give the cup to the laity? Do we celebrate facing the people? And all of those devotions that we discovered used to be celebrated by the congregation while a lonely priest said the Mass somewhere up front. Things like the Rosary and Novenas and all of those things have been pushed aside now so that people can corporately involve themselves entirely in offering that thanksgiving, which has given a very different flavour now to many Roman Catholic celebrations of the Eucharist. Let's talk briefly about a very different sort of service. In the evangelical tradition, a sort of hybrid service developed that evolved out of morning prayer and preaching, a sort of fusion of these two things. It was a sort of offshoot of the camp meeting. In Scotland, people used to be called together 4 times a year from many, many different areas, parishes, to come together for this, the wee free churches, they were called. Wee meaning small in Scottish, of John Knox. These that were at the origin of these camp revival meetings. The Scots would come together 4 times a year, probably something along the lines of clan meetings of particular areas, and they would come to communally repent, listen to the sermon, get some teaching. The whole thing culminated in a Eucharist, in a communion service. So this might have been inspired by the Scottish background, this camp meeting. So they came together preaching, prayer, hymn singing, spiritual counselling, and then these new converts would get themselves baptised, and the meeting would conclude with a Eucharist. It happened 4 times a year, and this was imported into these revival meetings in the camp tradition of the United States. And the goal was the conversion of sinners. The great pioneer of this is the man that you can see on the screen, Charles G. Finney. He was a Presbyterian turned Congregationalist, and he had a sort of Methodist theology. So he's a bit of a fruit salad in terms of his denominational background. He was trained as a lawyer, practiced as a lawyer for a short period of time in upstate New York, started to preach without a license, but was eventually recognized as a powerful preacher and was given a license to preach in the Congregationalist church. And he probably influenced worship life for the greatest number of Christians more than anybody else in the 1800s. Surprising that we haven't heard of him, but I don't think he'd be very proud of that as an achievement. He was a really fierce pragmatist, and he thought tradition had no importance whatsoever. And his influence was particularly felt in the Methodist, in the Reformed, and in the Puritan traditions, and also in the Lutheran tradition as well. The Anglicans resisted it, and the pattern goes something like this. This is the liturgy that he sort of invented. First of all, you have a service of prayer and praise with music and congregational singing. So extemporary prayer and just one Bible reading, not more than one. So there's your introduction. Next, at the center of this service, you're going to have fervent preaching, the major part of the service. Everything else felt like a run-up to the sermon. The singing, the reading, feels like you're getting ready for the main course. The sermon that was delivered called for the repentance of sinners, and it called for the godly to rejoice in the fact that they'd been saved. The sermon would conclude, and then there would be a harvest of those converted, or those who were recommitting their lives to Christ. This is their language, not mine. The altar call was rather a misnomer, because the altar call didn't lead to an altar. It led to a sort of thing that they called the anxious bench, where people would sit down seeking conversion and repentance, and they could be prayed over to be introduced into the full relationship with Christ through those prayers. So you've got the apéritif, which would be a little bit of singing, an extemporary prayer, and a single Bible reading. The main course served up by this gentleman on the screen, the powerful sermon, leading everybody to repentance, and then finally the harvest of souls at the end of the business. Now, interestingly enough, Finney was also a social activist. He preached at the First Congregational Church here in New York City, I think, as well. He was a social activist, and he was a campaigner against slavery. So this is a sort of Methodist part of the thing that is going on. So, yes, he did all of this harvesting and did all of that sort of business, but he really had a deep social concern rooted in him too, one which perhaps some modern manifestations of evangelicalism now that are the inheritors of Finney maybe don't have quite so much, unless it's about abortion. Maybe there are other social concerns that they're involved in, but their reaction to some things that certainly don't spring out of the sort of piety that we see in Finney. Now, the same thing can't be said for this gentleman. This is a man called Billy Sunday. Has anybody ever heard of him? Yeah, Wendy? Anybody else? Catherine? Yeah. Billy Sunday in 1917 preached in New York City to 1.5 million people in a 10-week campaign. He had about an 8% conversion rate. He used physical activities like furniture smashing, say, and a torrent of these harsh words against all the sins of the world. So he condemned high society, and filthy habits, and Washington insiders. Liberal preachers came in for some bashing, and trashy immigrants were bashed also by Billy Sunday. Here's another little image. Yeah. What he called for in this service that took exactly the same form as Finney's service. Finney invented it and Billy Sunday exploited it, if you want. He called for a whole series of fighting men of God who can fight against the liberal preachers and Washington insiders and the press and trashy immigrants. This call for these fighting men of God got lots of people up for the altar call. An innovation that he introduced were these choir, that the choir would come in first singing nice and softly to prepare people for what was about to come. And then there was this great sort of torrent that he engaged in afterwards. This softly singing choir was later employed also by Billy Graham in the Billy Graham missions. So what you can see here is an evolution of the liturgy that has taken a very interesting turn, and a very new turn, in fact. Something that doesn't really have very strong roots in the Christian prehistory, but something that was devised, flowing originally out of Methodism, that kept it grounded in this weekly service, but they had their Eucharists on their Sundays and did other things. This is now floated well away from the Eucharist, well away from all of those other aspects of Christian liturgy, and it's formed in a way of its own. The introductory thing, the sermon as the main part of what you're doing, the call to repentance, and the harvest of souls. This is a very, very different sort of liturgy that has sprung out of the Reform in the past 200 years or so. I think that's all I've got for this evening. Yes, it's 8:15. I think that was the last slide. We ended on a high note there. Good. So perhaps we can ask Joris to say a prayer for us before we say good night.
Seigneur, tu es au milieu de nous. Ton nom a été proclamé sur nous. Ne nous lâche pas, Seigneur notre Dieu. Venez à moi, vous tous qui peinez sous le poids du fardeau, et moi je vous donnerai le repos. Prenez sur vous mon joug, et mettez-vous à mon école, car je suis doux et humble de cœur, et vous trouverez le repos de vos âmes. Oui, mon joug est facile à porter, et mon fardeau léger. Bénissons le Seigneur.
Nous rendons grâce à Dieu. Guillaume, salut.
Oui, salut, merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous tous.